Hello, everyone. Buenos dias, good morning. Thank you all for being here so early in the morning. And before we start, I wanted to thank, of course, Elena Foster and Ivorypress for the amazing organization. I think we should give them a very big round of applause. And I wanted to also ask you to give a very, very warm welcome to our four amazing speakers today, to Christian Boltanski, Cristina Iglesias, Jorge Méndez-Blake, and Jeong. A very warm welcome. And it is, of course, magical to have a conversation here in this paradise of books. Because it's really a museum of books here and at the same time a laboratory of books, because as you know, there is a wonderful exhibition here of historic examples of artist books and which Ivorypress exhibits, and at the same time it's an active place which produces books and produces exhibition. It's almost like a book machine, one can also say, so there could not be a more wonderful context to have a conversation about books. And artist books have played a very important role in my life as a curator, and really from the very beginning. And it all started when I was 16 years old. We went on a school trip to Paris, and I went to visit Christian Boltanski and Annette Messager. And in this very first conversation, Christian explained to me that books are actually as important as exhibitions, that they're a form of, they're not documenting only exhibitions, but they have their own reality, and that in a way, books, as Anthony Powell once wrote, and Lawrence Weiner quoted him, books do furnish a room, but books are also very much, when artists do them, artworks, and they continue to actually be probably the most unwritten and least discussed part of art history. And so I think every opportunity, to emphasize the importance of artist book is important. So it's great that today we can talk with four artists about the books in their work. And Christian, I wanted to begin with you because the making of books has been an important part of your artistic practice, and you began in the late 60s with your first artist books. Can you tell me a little bit about the beginnings and what books mean to you?
Yeah. When you are a young artist, especially on this time, to make books was a way to show his own work and to create work, because at this time I didn't have any galleries, and to make a book is rather simple, and you can send the book to a lot of people, and it's like to produce an art piece that you can show. And for me, when I began to make books, what was important for me is that when you make an art piece, you can see the art piece, all the art piece in 1 minute. But when you make a book, there's a time problem because you must turn the pages. And it's something rather different because you have what we can call suspense. You don't know what is going to arrive at the next page. And it's another way. I mean, the books is like museum rooms, and you go from one room to another room because you go from one page to another page. And you have this relation with the time was very important for me. And also, it's like to put a bottle on the sea. You never know who is going to read the book. And all this book was sent to people. It was free books. But after some time, some were totally destroyed 1 minute after people receive it, and some were given to some other people. I mean, the books are something who travel all the time. And for me, after a few years after, I kind of found some of my books that I sent to a French friend in the States or in Australia. I mean, it's something which is really moving all the time. And I love this idea. And I think recently I was there is a prize called Bob Kahl Prize about books in Paris, and I was in the jury, and the big question was to try to make a definition, what is an artist book? And for me, the artist book first is something which is very cheap to do and very cheap to sell, or only to give, and something which is really nearly homemade. That means all my first books were not published by a publisher. It was made for me, and sometimes I make an exchange with somebody to print it. But all the books were something was really in my hand with no publisher. And for me it is something rather important that these little books are something very cheap, because you know you have books with an old tradition made by artists, but it's very beautiful paper, sign, very expensive. But for me that is another tradition. All the artist book I have made was not signed, by example. And after some time people told me, can you sign it? And I signed it, but it was no sign and no numbers. I think my first artist book was perhaps 200 copies or something like that, but I don't know exactly. And in the case, I think for me, especially on this time, I was speaking about 70, the artist book was something more or less made by the artist, not signed, and very cheap. And I didn't like on this time what we call beautiful books. With something, you know, I mean, the more beautiful books is jazz of Matisse, but it was not my, not the way that I believe that I want to make artist book. And now I made some artist book now also, but with a computer, that's another problem. You can work with a computer like an artist book. I mean, you can send with a computer things to somebody who is very far from you, and also you don't know exactly who is going to look at it. And what we have made with Hans Ulrich Obrist was something called an Agnès B, was a point d'ironie, with some kind of a newspaper within 100,000 copy, and with given, it's a free newspaper, was given everywhere. Because what we understood that to make a book or to make a newspaper is not so expensive. What is difficult is to distribute. I mean, the distribution is more difficult than the creation of a book. If you want, you can make a book in your kitchen, but after you must to send that to people, and you must to in the different countries. And for this reason, we have worked with Agnès B for this series of newspaper, because Agnès B had a lot of shops in a lot of countries, and for this reason, she had some kind of somebody who would take care of this shop in New York or in Tokyo or in a lot of countries, and we send 1,000 copy in New York or 2,000 copy in Tokyo, and after this guy is going to put that in the good cafe, in the good theater, and then the distribution is more difficult than the creation of a book. And for me, I always wanted not to have a book too precious only for collectors, but really to have a large distribution.
Now it's interesting also that it's something Gilbert and George once said, that a book is always there because exhibitions have a limited lifespan. They come and go. Whilst even if you have a small edition of a book, you said your early books had 200 copies, there's always at least one of these copies somewhere visible, so it doesn't go away anymore. And of course, it has this incredible circuit which you can never really predict. I mean, with the Point d'Ironie, the Agnès B newspaper, and artist book series. The other day I was in Japan and I switched on the television, and there was some film. I didn't understand the word because it was in Japanese, I saw in the hotel room, but I saw on the backdrop on the wall, was one of the Point d'Ironie which they had used. So it can appear where we expected the least, no?
And by example, Orozco made a very beautiful Point d'Ironie a few years ago, and it was at the time of Christmas. And everybody made Christmas gift with a horoscope paper. And it was another way to use it, but it was a good way to use it also. And in the case, what I love in artist book or in artist newspaper is that's what I said at the beginning, a bottle on the sea. We never know where it's going to go and how people are going to use it.
Now, your early books were already such bottles in the sea, and I was looking again yesterday at the very beginnings, the recherche et présentation de tout ce qui reste de mon enfance, de reconstitution d'un accident qui n'est pas encore arrivé, où j'ai trouvé la mort. Can you tell us a little bit about these earliest books? Because they have all to do with memory, with small memory, as you called it.
You know, it was only by chance. There was a gallery in Paris called Claude Givaudan, was a rather good gallery, and this guy had the idea to have a print machine in the basement. And you can, for very small money, use this print machine. And I was very young and knew nobody, and I have some ideas, and I began to make books with this print machine. And for me, this work, well, really very early work, are very similar to my work I'm doing now. I mean, it's not the same media exactly, but they are the same. I mean, in my work there's always question, and there was some question. And the first book that I made with Givaudan about what all the memory of my childhood is, I think, my first, I don't know if it is important, but important for me, my first important work for myself, and that it was possible because it was a book, and it was to be totally impossible for me at this time to make that in a museum or to make that in a gallery. And the books was like a room for me, like a show, really like a show.
And can you talk about this idea of memory? Because you said that these books have been about small memory, because often when someone dies, that memory disappears, yet that small memory is what makes people different from one another. Fragile memories also.
You know, I mean, all my work was a disaster, because from the beginning to now, I tried to fight against the fight of death and the fight of memory. And one of my questions is I believe that everybody is unique and very important, and at the same time everybody is so fragile. I mean, you can remember your great father, but you can't remember your great-great-father. And I always try to preserve, but in fact I always fail because it's totally impossible. But I don't know, when I make, like in Teshima in Japan, a place where you have something like 100,000 heartbeats. You have the heartbeats of a lot of people, but you have nothing. I mean, you can't fight against the fight of disappeared. And a large part of my work was about that, and I always fail. And in this first little book, I wrote, I want to put my life in a box and to preserve it, but I knew already that it was totally impossible. I mean, in a way, all my work is to show that it is impossible to preserve something.
Now, you've done so many artist books. I was looking yesterday at Bob Gall's catalogue raisonné of your artist book, because he worked for many years on a book. It's like a meta book. And actually, talking about artist books, I always love these books which bring together all the artist books of an artist. I was looking at it recently. It exists on Boetti. I've been working on the one on Gerhard Richter, gathering all his artist books. And Bob Gall has been doing it for you for many, many, many years. And there's almost 100 books in that book. So I wanted to ask you if there is any of these books which for you is particularly pivotal, or what's your kind of favorite?
I can say that my favorite books are the first years. Now, and by example, a book called Reconstitution, which was where I replay my childhood. I play again my childhood like an adult. Then all these books were very important for me, and it was really my way to speak, my way to make art was these little books. I always say that in the life of an artist there's very few time of creation. And for me, because I'm very optimistic, I believe that I have 3 times of creation. And my first time of creation was these little books, more or less. And after, when I was something like 45, my art becomes more visual. And I hope I have another time of creation when I become very old. Now, with something a little different, with no really, all my work now is more or less destroyed after the show. But in any case, all this first period was little books. And all these little books really are very important for me. And now I don't make so much little books. Now I've worked with the computers. I made a large series on the computers, but I don't make any more little books, I can say. I made one this year, but it was signed. That means it was not an artist book because it was signed. But I don't make artist book really now.
What's the little book you did this year? Can you tell us?
It's called Ave Maria. It's a school in Paris which is called Ave Maria. You have a series, you have a class photo. A class photo was made in 42 of little girls, and some of them have a Jewish sign, and some of them, half of them, die 1 year after. And you have a book with a portrait of all these little girls, but nearly invisible. And at the end, you have the real photo, but the photo is covered by a, scratch. I mean, it's silver, and you must to scratch to see the photo. And for me, when you turn the pages, it's impossible to know who is going to survive and who is going to die. And at the end, you have the solution. And it's also about destiny, because all these little girls have the same face, but some die 1 year after. And in any case, it's also working with the idea of a book, because you have some kind of a suspense. Who is this? Who is the one who is going to die? And after, you must to scratch, and you find the truth. But in any case, that's more or less a collector books, I can say. But for me, the artist books are always very useful for young artists, because it's a way to speak and to touch people who are far from you with something, with a space, because a book is a space, like a gallery, and very easy to do.
And that's a great definition, the idea of the book as a space, and brings us really to Cristina and to your book. I wanted to ask you as a first question. I've been looking again at it this morning. It was published here at Ivorypress, and I remember always when Elena Foster told me about it, she was so excited because she told me, it's like an architecture. It's in a way a book which unfolds. So it's a tiny book, which at the same time is a very big book, which opens up many spaces. And it's in that series. I think it's the rarest book in that series now, because it's been such a success. It's impossible to find it. Can you tell us a little bit about the genesis of that very important little book?
Yeah, it's a book that is called La Jalousie, based on Robrier, and it's actually the pages form a space, form an architecture, as you said, and it has to do with many pieces that I've done that, where the literature, the text is a physical structure of the piece. So I could do actually one book for each of those pieces or each of those texts that I've been using all these years. They're also because of, in those pieces I work with the transparency, the invisibility, the hiding away from what you can see and not so the pages are in transparent paper or plastic and is in French in the original language, but then the translation comes at the end. I think it's, for me, has been, in that sense, the text literature has been very important. At one point, I even, as I'm saying, I use it physically. But not only that, I mean, it's, well, but referring to your question, I mean, it is actually, I could do one book of each of those pieces, you know. One day I would like to actually do all the, or maybe to put them together, because it's interesting how I have been choosing certain texts from science fiction to 19th century literature, French literature, you see, and it always has to do with the fantasy.
But that's interesting also because I saw your exhibition in Santander, which I think is still on, no?
Yes,
it's still
well,
ongoing.
very few days.
For those of you who haven't been to Santander, it's urgent to go there. And very often in your also architectural pieces, text appears. So I wanted to ask you to tell us a little bit about that, about the importance of literature and how it actually, these lines of the text become part of your spaces, how you bring the books into the space.
Yeah. Well, as I said, I mean, in those jealousy pieces, I've used texts that actually talk about spaces. They describe a space, like from Impression d'Afrique to Huisman Against Nature, well, Arebo. But then when the pieces, I started doing suspended pieces, hanging pieces, like corridors or pavilions, I started using science fiction texts like Ballard and others, Arthur C. Clarke and well, several ones. And it actually has to do with the physical, also in terms of physics. I mean, because it's a dream, is a story that is somehow you recollect it as unreal, but at the same time it is always related with a physical phenomenon. And the same way in the sculpture, it becomes physical in its presence and it is structure.
And of course, that has also to do with the idea. I mean, Christian was mentioning that now with the computer, things change and we move towards the more digital and online forms of sharing information, in which printing and publications are evolving. And that, of course, has also an impact, I suppose, on the world of artist books. So I was wondering, what are your thoughts about the future of artist books in that digital age?
Well, I think they become somehow closer, easier. Closer, I mean, to the artist in the sense that always the book has something of like an exhibition or like a notebook or something in between. In that sense, you can go also from the details of things without trying to be too explicit. I think it gives you room to play with it to an extent that maybe, as I said, it gets closer to the artist. You don't need to go through a publisher, somebody that has to understand what you are trying to say. And I think that's very important.
And your works, of course, often also contain a retrospective case have to do with memory. And Christian told us in such a beautiful way about this, about memory, and also about the possibility and the impossibility to preserve memory. So I wanted to ask you how important the past is for you. You once said in an interview that working with memory is inevitable, and that your memory is often very intertwined and helps you to find a thread, and there is also history. Can you tell us about memory in relation to books?
Well, I think memory is also a conversation. I mean, you can avoid memory, and actually is a good fountain also to give you water to keep living, but keep alive. But is also the memory of your own work that is there, which is what I think I was referring there, that is intertwined in the sense that I like, and I think my work, my pieces are, all are related to each other. And actually I would like that one day make it possibly, visible somehow. In certain works, I like the idea that even talking about public pieces, that one piece has the memory of another in the other side of the world. And that interests me a lot, this connection, and this connection with memory, also with the memory of the planet.
And then there is, of course, the poetic use of space, dreamscapes in the work, and that has again to do also with literature. We mentioned before, fiction, and that somehow brings us also to the island. I wanted to ask you to tell us about that.
That's a book I would like to do.
That's why.
Yeah. I'm doing this project. Well, I have worked already in another island, and also I have another idea of doing an island not in the water, but in the fields. But I'm doing a project in an island, and is the idea of the remote in the city, because it's really an island that is in San Sebastian. Is really like a public piazza, but of course in the middle of the bay. So how to make a book? A book would be like a film, like how to go there, the possibility and impossibility implicit of not being able to go, depending on the weather. The idea of getting lost in the island, the lighthouse, where the piece will be placed, or will be the house will be transformed into one piece all inside. So then to go in the experience with the sound and how you do that in a book. I like books that look like books, that are like books. So I will try to get to those sensations with text and images, and so I would like to do a book that will hold all that, and then go into the abstraction of one can see getting in a hole, getting towards the depth of the sea. Sorry, I have a cold and I can hardly speak.
No, but thank you so much. That's wonderful. And maybe, you already answered my question about, future books, because if you think about the book you did for Ivorypress, and then we think about that such a book could exist on each of your pieces, that would be like a Cristina Iglesias library. It's kind of beautiful. Are there other artist books you've been working on? Because you also work a lot with printmaking.
Yes.
So I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about that, because that also is, of course, a whole other, as Christian mentioned, there are the artist books which are basically for everyone, which are not signed. But then there is, of course, a whole history also of the artist book, which is the opposite, which is a very rarefied book with original prints, which is also, books between artists and novelists, or between artists and poets. Is that something you explore?
Yeah, that's something that I would like to do more. I think in every artist studio there are, let's say, like the German of many books, that could be done especially if you work with prints and poetry and text, etc. Many things could be transformed or connected in books. So that's something that is always in my mind, and is always a project to take place. At the same time that you do other books that deal with pieces you are doing in the world.
And that, of course, leads us also to the almost utopic book. And I always remember when I started to work at the Musée d'Art Moderne in Paris with Suzanne Paget, she was telling me this great story about James Lee Byers, who had an exhibition, and somebody for whom artist books played a big role, and he had an exhibition at the Musée d'Art Moderne, and he told Suzanne that he wanted to make a golden cube, of thousands of pages, and it had to be the perfect object. And Suzanne, as the museum director, explained to him that it would be very difficult, because it would cost millions to do such a book. But he said it just has to happen. So he got so upset when he realized that it could not happen that he locked the director into her office and ran away with the key. and it's a kind of a famous James Lee Bayer story. Now, this leads us to a first question for Jeong, because of course, your book for the Swiss Cultural Foundation, Swiss Ray, is such an almost infinite book. It's basically a decision you made that instead of expressing your thought in words, you drew them, and it's 1001 line drawings. It's kind of a record of daily life. Can you tell us about this book?
So, when I travel to European countries from my original country, I had some different contact collaborators through school, as I met Christian Boltanski at school, Hans Ulrich Obrist at the exhibition space. I also made a lot of books by myself to show how it's about my work. Then a couple of years and then books and the publishers started to recognize the Jeong is making some books sometimes nice. So the curators get the idea, like Beatrix Roof at that moment at the Swiss Re in a very special insurance company in Switzerland. Had a book project with artists, one book publishing per year, already done a couple of years. And then she wanted me to make a book. That was very interesting. The company had idea as a very precise frame that has the precise budget, the limited date, when has to go original printer to go to the printers, when we release the book and launch the book where and with whom, etc. So it was a very interesting frame, a different trajectory I never ever have experienced. So I had 1 year to make 1001 pages of drawings I proposed, and so I had to make that book 1001 pages drawings book. Of course, all design of the book myself, and in 6 months, you see. So doing some meeting, how to make a design, where to do, who print, what kind of color of print we go, and how original papers should be prepared. So we wanted to make a very nice print of line of old felt pen drawings, nicely printed. So we started to make a same size of original print to the book to make a drawing. So I kind of made up all those pages and go to print into 3 kind of blue color from 5, 6 kind of blue color. Then we made up in the end and Swiss Re.
Now the drawings are short stories, you said, of your life. They're like traveling. You met people. Now it's interesting also that this very physical book has also become now the kind of point of departure of the Instagram account. You basically publish some of these drawings every day. Can you talk a little bit about that?
So we had 1 year into production, and we my book compare other artists' book was very huge pages and big quantity, big volumes. 101 pages, including 3-4 writers write of what each of them related to my work, and who I have to ask. So we discussed that. so it was a very big book. So we decided we can't print more than 500 copies. So we decided to print only 350 copies at that moment. So we printed and we rounded it. When the book launches, we had to bring all the books to the council members of the Swiss company, and then collectors who helps the company and all my work. So the rest of those distribution all sold out already since we launched it 1 year and 2 years. So it doesn't exist anymore. 350 copies. It's nothing compared with big contribution. So 10 years later, social network is very active without any effort in our world, as well as cultural world like Instagram, as Facebook, Google Images, etc. So I discussed some of our team that I would be good to relaunch all the drawings into Instagram. Then nobody knows about these drawings because a small count of the books, and then yes, it's long, like 10 years ago, but a long time ago for those people, actually our time. So we started to launch 1 to 5 drawings per week to Instagram. Then we discovered with other announcement like other installation shot or my work, or announcement of my speech today with the Ivorypress.
It's like a diary.
Like a diary. Then it helps for everybody. So it's how it started into Instagram.
Now another book is a book you did with Yvan Lambert, which is a collaboration with Edouard Glissant, where an idea was to insert a word into a dictionary. Can we talk about that book? Because that was another quite epic kind of project.
So my work, as I'm into making a film about Oghuz, I wanted to print into the dictionary. So my publisher and gallerist in Paris at the time wanted to make a book into French dictionary, not English dictionary. So we had the idea to get the dictionary, physical dictionary from Larousse, that still doing the French dictionary with the words. So they don't want us use their dictionary. But Flammarion, Mr. Flammarion himself, he stopped to publishing the French dictionary with the French words, because he was into more in specialized dictionary like scientific dictionary or literal dictionary or natural dictionary, etc., etc. So he was friend of Yvan Lambert. He gave us the physical dictionary. And then there is the invention of the machine that copies all the books digitally that time, so that I saw in the newspaper that week. So we contact this company that can copy the books. It's lots of books. I can copy it. I can digitally scan, and we could insert the words Oghuz with the translation, invented translation I kind of made of. So mixed of words I made and the Flammarius made up. Then the frame of this book of Yvan Lambert Publishing was collaboration with the artist and the author. So I was talking to Edouard Glissant, who passed away 2014. He agreed to write some words related about Oghuz. So he talked about in very small, short text about imaginary landscape physically exist when he was in Martinique, about small creek landscape, hill. He talked about that. That was kind of a collaboration about Flammarius.
And then there was Frozen with a Smile. That's a book in Kitakyushu, with CCA, and that's actually a strange book because you cannot really open it. You have to make a decision, and in that sense, it kind of connects to, you know, Christian's scratch books, of which there are several, because once you scratch it, you know, it's a decision.
Yeah, when you make I made some books who are scratched, I mean, they are in silver, and they are very beautiful because they are in silver. And you have, you can have the book just like that, like a silver book, but you can also scratch, and you can see very awful images of dead person. And it's a decision of each reader. And what was interesting for me is that sometimes some collectors or some reader scratch the first page and say, no, I can't go on, it's too awful, and leave like that. And some scratch all the pages. That means each book at the end was different because each one used it in a different way, or to keep the beauty with the silver book, or to see the reality with the awful. And the fact that the reader makes the book in a way was very important for me. He used the book and makes the book because each book is different.
And that's actually the truth for Frozen. That's true for Frozen with a Smile in a way, because the reader there needs to make a decision. The pages are glued, and then you make a decision. Either you destroy it and then you can read it or look at it, or you keep it as an object. Can you tell us about the Frozen with a Smile?
Frozen with a Smile produced in CCA in Kitakyushu in Japan. When I was invited in the art center in Kitakyushu, CCA, where the Akiko Miyake and Nobuo Nakamura running the institution. Doing the residency with the artist as a professor to the school, because they build up a little school with a practitioner, but it's not called that the student. So artists reside 1 month or 2 months with them, and free to go to talk with them, not to really teach, but free to go to talk with them and make some event with them or nothing, whatever. I'm doing also one book with Akiko Miyake, who is also designing the invitation card or the website, etc., for the CCA in Kitakyushu. So I had the idea when I get there, as they have a lot of range of papers and idea of small materials, how to print the letters over cover materials. So I had a very big freedom to choose whatever I can. But we had just one frame that is the size of book. So we are free to thickness, but size of book we were fixed. Then we go, choose the paper inside and then cover, and then it was very simple and
And another way of publishing the drawings is the recent book with Henny, where all of a sudden the pages are like really thick and it becomes kind of like almost an object. Can you talk about that book, which came out a few months ago?
Yeah, so it's again come back to the Swiss Re publishing book in 2006. I missed so much because they have only 350 page the editions we don't have anymore in our hands. So I put in Instagram to publishing every day some of those, and into another book into Henny Publishing where. When I met the collector, Lebanese collector in London, who is a lawyer actually, and then he has in his hobby publishing company built under his father's name. And we had the idea to publish the book, selected 20 pages from the Swiss Re book I made with the Swiss Re called R, and we named another selection onto another design, and then we get a new book last year.
So it's like an infinite book which kind of keeps producing new books. And that idea leads us to Jorge. I wanted to, because in a way also, Jorge, your practice connects a lot to what Cristina was telling us about, this idea of translating literary texts into images, sculptures, and installations. You've just done an amazing new book, which is actually almost a book of everything. In a similar way as Kuz, Swiss Ray book is a book of everything. But before that, I wanted to ask you, tell us a little bit about how you combine these two passions of yours, literature and architecture, because you say that neither of them finishes filling you up, and you're not comfortable working on one of them on their own. So in a way, through art, you can bring it together.
Yes, I think books are a very nice intermediary. I think sometimes the works of art are isolated from the viewer, and we artists try to find ways of connecting your artwork to the world. And in that sense, the book works as a great place a comfortable place. So if a book has many ways of approaching, but I think, for example, when a book find itself in a different situation than the normal situation, which is a library, in this case an exhibition, then this book begins to have different readings. And all the books have a title and have a design and have a physical presence. And I think that presence and that physicality makes a fierce approach with the viewer, in this case reader. So if it's, for example, a Kafka book, then you have a first thought about Kafka and what Kafka means, and then you approach the artwork in a different situation.
And why Kafka? What is the relevance of this particular book? Because it's the castle, really, you reference.
Yes, well, I love Kafka, and I love the Kafkanian way of seeing the world, which I think is very very contemporary. We found ourselves in this madness of living that we don't find any sense. So in the castle, for example, in which I use a book to make a little transformation in a structure made of bricks. I think the books remind us of how a small thing can really have an impact in the world, which is the book. I think the book, being a small object in relation to other ones, can really have an effect in culture and in the way we approach our reality.
And you said that writing is itself a kind of construction and reading a way of creation?
It's totally. José Gorostiza, the Mexican writer, modern writer, used to say that writing was as building a architecture. That a poem should have a foundation and then a structure and then a roof. So in that way, I think, now that you mention architecture, I think books have a similarity with construction and structure. And in that sense, I think when you put them together, they begin to have new meanings, and architecture changes and the book changes. So we find ourselves in a point which is in the middle, and new readings begin to appear.
And of course, the physical object of the book, like the other three speakers before, plays a very crucial role in the work. So I wanted to ask you, tell us a little bit more about the book as an object. The outside, you said before, reading it is like an intermediary between content and the world. And maybe it's good that you give us a few examples of your books, and particularly this most recent book, which is the book of everything.
I think we artists are like frustrated writers in a way. So maybe we are in the artwork because we cannot be in the literature work. But when we talk about books, I think we are just skipping something that is very important, which is we are talking about literature, and we are talking about ways of writing, ways of reading, and ways of archiving the books, which is libraries. So when as an artist you came to this point, when you have to make a book, then you begin with this problem: how am I going to write, and how am I going to choose to show that writing? So in that case, I just last year I made a book in which I tried to be in the middle between an artist book and a catalog, in that sense. And yes.
And your own artist books? Do you have projects, or can you tell us about?
And no,
Because there are these different types we were discussing. You know, there is, Christian was telling us about this idea of, you know, really DIY books, which are not expensive, which are not signed. At the same time, you know, we were talking about this idea also of more precious, more rare books. Well, how do you position yourself in that field of all these possibilities of artist books?
I'm not sure. I think for me it's always a struggle between how to write without writing. So in that sense, it's always the approach of making an artwork is similar to the approach of making a book in a way, no? And I found this similarity between making exhibitions with the making of books. So I think exhibitions are in a way should be understood as making a book, no? Because you read things. And also I'm a Mexican artist, I live in Mexico. So in Mexico we don't have a lot of budget to produce books. So the first time I came to Europe, I don't know, 10 years ago, I realized all the artists have already like 10 books published, and I didn't have any. So in that sense, I think the context is important, and sometimes you can produce books in a very cheap way, in a very direct way, but I think you are not really making books, but you are making like an extension of your practice as an artist in a way. So you find an easy way or a quick way to make writings and to make in this case books.
And you reference a lot of, you know, other authors. It's not only Kafka. You reference Beckett, Borges. I found references to Emily Dickinson, to Edgar Allan Poe, to Shakespeare, to Jules Verne. How do you select these texts?
I really love the classics, and I think the classics are up to a lot of new readings and contemporary readings. I work with certain writers because I feel really comfortable with them. I mean, for me to use a book in an installation or to use a fragment of a text in a piece should be something that you really, really are comfortable and familiar with. So in that sense, I think I use the things that I used to read when I was young, when I was a teenager, or when I was at least younger. I think that in that sense, the career of an artist sometimes is trying to find yourself in the same position as a young reader. So I remember, for example, reading some classics or some short stories when I was younger, and getting to these wonderful moments in the in certain moment of a reading, which I still remember very, very warmly. And I think it's something that I try to do with my work. Obviously, you fail all the time, and you fail, and you fail, and you will never get to these wonderful moments of the classics, but it's something that you wake up and you try every day.
What are you reading at the moment?
At the moment, I am a mess, like 15 things at the same time and none of them. But no, yes, I would say
I wrote here one thing.
Mircea Cantarescu, exactly.
Can you tell us about that?
Cantarescu, it's I don't know, maybe it's very well, of course it's very well known here in Europe, but in America it's not that well known. And I just bumped into him in a book fair, and there was a few books like they were promoting because he had just won a prize. And then I began reading, and I felt this wonderful emotion that you feel when you connect to a book again. Because I said that I was reading 15 books because maybe I'm looking for something in those books that connect or certain energy with the reading. And I read this fantastic short story that reminded me a lot of Borges, which is the Ruleter, in Spanish El Ruletero, which is this wonderful story about the people that plays the roulette game with the gun. And it's a fantastic story. And then you realize that it's still possible to make good literature and good writings and things that you can connect, which is a relief, I think, at the end.
That brings us back to Cristina, because of course the importance of literature in your work and research has always been there ever since we met many, many years ago. You often talked about, I remember we talked about John Berger. There's always been not only the importance of, looking at that author like Borges, but also actually working with authors of our time. Can you tell us a little bit about that?
About
How
working
you work with
with
literature and the
Well,
importance of literature
it's-
in your work and research.
Yeah, I think is always going back to a lot of things. I mean, readings that are in your mind. It's funny because now tomorrow I'm going far from here, and I was thinking now the e-book where you can have a library in it, so you get all the books that you had already read and new ones. So it's a compendium of and a mix of incredible different sources. Like yesterday, I found this Borges with, it's Borges and Bioy Casares on Stevenson, and it's like a compendium of essays and fiction, and at the same time, Clarice Lispector, and at the same time, it goes on and on and on, and this is something that actually before, when you were talking also about other mediums, nowadays you can have everything in a little tablet, and travel with it, and study and connect, and I think this is something extraordinary. In another way to work with, I would like to work with writers today, like Berger, we had a connection, but nowadays I'm not so connected with writers that are today writing.
Because when I interviewed Jean Berger, he told me about you and the friendship,
Yeah.
and yeah.
Once we call him, you remember?
Exactly.
From
We call him
London.
together. And in a
Yeah.
similar way, Christian, we had these interactions with Jacques Roubaud, whom you introduced me to, and the Oulipo movement. I always remember from the very beginning of our conversations, you talked about the importance of Oulipo and the rule of the game, and you and Roubaud also worked on a book together. Because that's interesting, I think it's an interesting other subcategory, of artist books, is when artists and writers do books together.
Yes, I have made 2 books with Jacques Roubaud, and in fact, we have a lot of elements who are similar. I mean, it's the idea to try to make rules and to work with a book with rules. And he made a book with, I use a lot of names in my work, a lot of list of names who can be, I don't know, workers in a factory in England in the 19th century, or artists at the Venice Biennale, only names. And he made all the work about this name with other category, I don't know, all the name who looks like food, like Francis Bacon, for example, because he was in Venice. And I made, there was a book made by Queneau, 1 million of poetry, and I made something with faces of people, and there's, I think at the beginning, something like 20 faces, but you can make thousands and thousands of faces to mix them. I mean, all the faces are cut in 3 parts, and after you can mix them. In my work, not like our friend here, I have not so many relations with literature, but I wanted to say that I think the first artist for me who really made artist book was in the modern time, during the 70s, was Ed Ruscha and Hans-Peter Fellman. There was really this idea of books were unlimited, not signed, and most of the time with no language, only images. And after, if we go back during the surrealistic time, there's somebody like Paul Nouget, who was very important for me, who also made some kind of images and little books with no text. But in any case, I always wanted to make a book with a poet, and my idea is that you have a poetry on a page, and when you read it, the text disappeared because the ink can't support the light. And I think it would be beautiful to have a book of poetry, but you know you can read it only one time, and after the book is totally white, and you can only remember the poetry.
That's like your photos. When you have these photos, when you look at them, they disappear.
Yeah, I made a lot of pieces would disappear like that with the light. And you know, I was always surprised as people are collectors of wine. Because when you have a bottle of wines, you have nothing. And after you drink it, but after you have no more the bottle. And I made several pieces that you have photos were in box, closed box. And when they have, by example, they have 2 hours of life, and each time you look to these photos, you know that you kill it a little, and you say, oh, today I wish to look at the photo 5 minutes, but you know that you are going to, this 5 minutes is finished after that, and after 1 hour or 2 hours, it will be totally dark, and the photo is dying slowly, like that, becoming more and more dark. But this idea that to have something that would disappear when you use it, is something that interests me a lot. And if I have to work with a poet, it would be this idea that you must to try to remember the poetry very quickly before the poetry disappeared.
And that leads us to my last question, before we open it up to the floor for all your questions. I want to ask our 4 speakers about your dream books, your unrealized books. Books, when James Lee Byers locked in Suzanne Paget into the office because he never did it. That remained an unrealized project, this Golden Cube, right? If you have any books which were too big to be realized or too small to be realized, or dream books, maybe we start with Cristina.
Actually, I don't have any too big or too small idea for a book. But as we said, I have many books in mind that I would like to realize, like even the piece, now that we are here in the foundation, the Foster Foundation, the piece I have there that has the text of the ionosphere. That's a book I would like to realize. It's from Fountains of Paradise, and the Book of the Island that I told you. That's a book that I would like to realize.
And can you tell us about the piece here in the foundation you would like to do a book of? Because it's a book which connects to the architecture also of Norman.
Yes, but I would like also to work, it connects to the architecture of Norman, certainly, to the idea of creating a shadow, to creating a place in an openness, and the hanging of it all between buildings. Is again, like in many of my pieces, how to talk about the detail can talk about the whole. And in that sense, also the text becomes a part of it because it's unreadable somehow, but it's there, it's present, it's true. It describes a place in the above the atmosphere, in the ionosphere, and is science fiction, but from Arthur C. Clarke. As I said, the Fountains of Paradise, but at the same time, it's a real place that exists, a place of magnetism. So you can always, when you do a book, talk about those images that relate, in that case, a book of a piece, to that piece, but also to other things that the piece touches, like, as I said now, magnetism, or a lot of ideas about what are the physical forces, that or the winds that will move that piece. So you can start making connections and do a book, and I would like to do that book too.
Thank you. Christian, your unrealized books?
I can say I have a very large library with now at the City Museum in Paris, and it's all the telephone books of the world. And we have something like 5,000 telephone books. That means it's in a rather small room, and you have so many people there, so many names of people and so many peoples, and you can read them. That means there's a table, and you can take them and read them. I realize that you can, if you want to have, I don't know, to see where you can find a pizzeria in Cape Town, you can find that. But in any case, my idea was to name all the people who are living on Word. But now the telephone book disappeared. There's no more telephone books. That means I can't finish this piece because there's no more telephone books, but you can find that also on the computers. But my idea was to have so many people in the small rooms. I wanted to say the name of everybody who is living on Earth on this moment. But the problem is that if you say the name, people die so quickly and are born so quickly. After 5 minutes, the list is not good anymore because there's new people and some people are disappeared and there's also new people. And you can't have the good list. I mean, this piece of telephone books was made something like 20 years ago, but I'm sure that so many people died and so many people are new that this list of people are not good at this moment.
It's actually one of my favorite artist book of yours is this Malmö one, no? Where,
yeah.
Because you did this partially in Malmö, where you sort of, it was a ready-made, the telephone book of Malmö, and then you added...
Yes, I mean, I made a show in Malmö, and it was a catalog of the show. I asked to have the telephone book a year before, and it's a normal telephone book, and we look all the people who die in the meantime. And at the beginning, there's 3 pages called errata. These people can't answer to the telephone anymore. And it's all the people who can't answer to the telephone because they are dead. And you have only 3 pages of the errata. That means the telephone book exists, but you have 3 pages of errata that people can't answer to the telephone anymore. And it's always a question when you have a friend who dies, you never know what to do in your telephone book or your own telephone book if you mess... It's awful, and if you keep it, it's very sad. You know, we never know how to use with that. And for this reason, this errata, these people can't answer to the telephone anymore, was very funny for me to do that. And it was very cheap catalog, I can say, because something like 1,000 pages was for nothing, and only to print 3 pages.
And cool, can you tell us about your unrealized book or dream?
Yeah. So I think I would love to realize some book that smells, you know, like smelly human, you know, Pitch Dark, Interstellar, something like that, like 2 pages of book that totally physically separated the smells, something like that.
Great, thank you so much. The book that smells, and Jorge?
I think for me it's not a material which is strange or an unrealizable book. What is unrealizable for me, which is to write just a simple poetry book, which for me is impossible.
Thank you all so much. A big round of applause for our speakers. And we can now open it up for your questions. If you have questions here or questions here, questions from all sides are welcome. Yeah, we've got a question here, if you can have the microphone.
Hi, I just wanted to ask, when you're making work, do you have any sort of conflicts between aesthetics and the content of the work? So when you're choosing what to produce, what conflicts do you have when if it's just aesthetic or with the actual content? I'm not sure if you know what I mean.
It was difficult to hear for us.
I just wanted to know, when you're making work, what conflicts exist with aesthetics and with the content or the subject matter of the work? So maybe, for example, with Christian was talking about his book with the silver on it. Why did you feel it was necessary to use the silver and gold?
Because when you, I don't know if you have that here, but in France we have some kind of little game you can, if you want to win, it's called, you have something in silver and you scratch and you can have the good number or the bad number and you win money. And that's the idea, it's always in silver, and that's the reason I use silver. But also, I mean, all my books and all my art are always around question. And in this case, the question, what I've said was, do you like best to have the beauty with silver, but not the truth, or to scratch and to see the truth with, for me, totally awful? And it's a question, and it's a question for each person. I mean, if you see an accident in the street, or you know that you don't have to look, but you want to look at it. And that's the question, if you have to look at something awful, or if you have to keep some kind of a beauty with outside of the reality. That's why I choose the silver.
Do we have more questions? Yeah, we've got a question here.
Thank you. I mean, most of you had made a connection between the books and the brain in a way. You know how books have helped you structure in your ideas, or how book is a memory, or like how, you know, like there is this direct connection between the way we think and the way we write, or the way we organize our ideas in books. I was just wondering, like, if it's possible for an artist or for a collection of artists to make a book for someone who has Alzheimer, you know, someone who has already the disease where your memory loss is disappearing, and at the very beginning you don't remember your name, then you don't remember your family, your ties, you know, your photographs, album, family, and then very lately you don't even remember how your organs work, you don't remember how you open and close your eyes. So I was wondering, you know, if in the whole mental processes of like losing your memory within Alzheimer, this could be recorded in an artist's book.
Who wants to answer that?
I think that actually the abstraction that one artist can use in books, I imagine that can be perceived by somebody in its own way, because of course for anybody, for each one would be a different perception. But I think one could work, or ideally, for somebody that doesn't remember, and maybe using images that can be composed in a way that you hope, like music, that could arrive to another in a way that this person can make its own composition. I believe so.
What I can say with difference, I mean, I travel a lot, and for me, I'm not sure that I have a country. My country is art. And a book is something you can have in the pocket. I mean, for somebody who is always everywhere, you transport with a book your own country and your home. And if you are a collector, to have art piece is very heavy. You need to have flat, you need to have walls. But if you have a book that you love, it's only something small in the pocket, and you can be everywhere, in the desert or in the forest. You have your art piece in your pocket, or what you need in your pocket. And perhaps it's one of the beauty of the small books, is something with traveling with you, and traveling with you during all the life. And yeah, you are You know, there was Robert Fidiou, and he created the art gallery. He had an art, and if somebody asked him in a cafe, what are you doing? He put his art on the table, and all his art pieces were in the art, and in very little boxes. And he transport all his art with him. And in the case when you make books, you can transport all your art with you. And for somebody like me, it's very important I can decide now to stay in Madrid, and I can have a little luggage with all my books, and it will be all what I have done. And I don't need a big truck with transport to transport a large piece. Everything is in a small luggage. And perhaps that's one of the beauty to make books.
Do we have more questions? Yeah, we've got a question here in the back.
Thank you very much. As Christian mentioned before, books or traditional books have an implicit linearity where everyone starts at the first word and then everyone ends in the last one. But I believe in art books, this sort of narrative sometimes can be broken. So I was wondering if for any of you this linearity is implicit in your creation process of your artist books. If you use this linearity, if you use it in a linear way, or if you intend to break it intentionally, how do you position yourself? I believe in every book, maybe you have a different answer for every one of your single books, but maybe how do you position yourself with this idea of the traditional book as a linear narrative device?
So artists are very free to come with a kind of material. This I myself positioned with the frame of the book, something like before Gutenberg, after Gutenberg, you know, where we don't have any technique to reproduce the book, you know. So we can be very free to make it our position and frame ourselves. As well, for the last question, we can launch another new frame of the project to make a book for blind or the deaf, you know, special project for medical wise, you know. But actually, basically, the book, the artist project are to protect, to become a crisis, you know, not to heal the things what has happened, you know. That is the other way I'm approaching art and book with a project, special project.
No, I wanted to say only that perhaps there's some kind of a private relation with the book. When you see an art piece on the wall, you have not this kind of private relation. You know, a book is something you can read in your bed and with very close from you. And for this reason, perhaps it's something more, we can touch you more because it's really only for you. You are, you know, inside the book, you know, and you can have this book in the metro or in the bed, and you have some kind of like a part of you. And perhaps that's one of the beauty of a book, that is something you have in the pocket, and you can look everywhere, and with totally, at the same time it's collective because the book is in a lot of copies, but at the same time each one who has the book has something precious inside him, and he's going to look alone, to look only for him. And it's not the same relation with the art piece. And perhaps somebody who have books, you have some kind of a, I don't know, sacred object, or object with a precious only for himself, like a protect object. And he knows, I mean, that he is never alone because he can be everywhere and he can open his book. And I think that's the beauty of books, and that's the beauty of artist's book.
Can maybe take one last question?
No question.
Maybe I could just say thank you, Hans Ulrich Obrist, to be here with us and lead this wonderful conversation. Thank you to our 4 speakers. A big thank you to be here with us. And I just wanted to mention when we finish that you can maybe close the conversation. We will put the chairs to one side and invite you for a glass of cava and have some time to chat and see that also Edmond de Waal's exhibition Breath and his artist book.
I think, yeah, it's indeed urgent to see the exhibition, but it's urgent also to see the amazing books, which you can see here. And it's kind of interesting because we were speaking about realized books and unrealized books. And here, of course, you have this Valcárcel Medina, archive book. And that's why it is important to speak about unrealized projects, why I believe always it's so fundamental to talk about unrealized projects, because we know a lot about architects' unrealized projects because they publish them every day and they get reality built through that. But we know almost nothing about artists' unrealized projects. We know even less about unrealized books. And it is here in this very space that we did an interview, a long conversation with the legendary Spanish conceptualist Valcárcel Medina. And he was telling about his dream of his unrealized project. And the amazing thing is that Elena Foster said, let's do it. And what you actually see here is, the realized project of this archive of Medina. And of course, there are many, many more books to discover. I also thought it was nice, actually, to conclude on Christian's remark about this portability, this idea that we can take the book wherever we want, that we can travel with the book, that it creates an intimacy in the rapport we can very seldomly have with artworks. I mean, it does exist with artworks. I was the other day asked to choose my favorite work in the Musée d'Orsay, because there is this new series Donatien Grau is doing where they invite, curators, artists to the Musée d'Orsay. So I spent, hours there, and I suddenly realized that actually my favorite artwork there are these 2 tiny little paintings by Seurat, 2 nudes by Seurat, which actually Félix Fénéon used to own, the great, writer and curator and publisher and gallerist. Félix Fénéon used to never leave his house without these 2 paintings of Seurat in his pocket of the coat. And whenever he would arrive in an ugly hotel room, and most hotel rooms have ugly art on the wall, not all of them, but most, he took down the painting, and installed his Seurat. And he talked about this intimacy, of the rapport of these, 2 Seurat paintings in his coat. And it came to my mind when Christian told me this story. And this is, of course, also why we founded with Hans-Peter Fellmann in the 90s, the Nano Museum, which was a museum of 2 by 3 inches, which I'd carried everywhere, wherever I went, and I showed it to bus drivers, I showed it to people I met in the cafe, and it was basically a museum as a portable museum. Of course, the beauty is that with artist books, we can do that every day. We can always have an artist book, in our pocket, and it can follow us wherever we go, and of course, leads us also to the portable museum of Marcel Duchamp. And Christian, you once, and that's maybe the last thing I wanted to mention, you once did a box, a bit like Duchamp's museum, where you reprinted many of your books, right? It's like your own portable book museum.
Yes, it was also a way to destroy it. Because, when I made these little books during the 70s, they was more or less free. And now with the time they become more expensive. People sell it. And I wanted a little to destroy that, and I reprint all my old books, but it's totally impossible to see the difference between the original and the reprint. And it was some kind of also because the idea of a book for me is not to make a precious book. And everything becomes precious after some time. And for this one, I wanted to reprint them. And, I knew somebody, Bob Carl, who made this book about me, would pretend, but I'm not sure it is true, that he can see if it was the first or the second edition. But he was the only one who says that he can do that, and I'm sure it was true. But in the case, I really wanted to make something so similar that nobody can see if they was 30 years old or only 5 years old, you know. And for me, really, the beauty, I'm going to say something awful. When I travel, very often I buy a book, and in a cheap edition, and I destroyed it because it's too heavy to my bag. And when I read 30 pages, I destroyed it, and I buy it another one. And I think the beauty of a book is the fact that it is unlimited, and you can always. It's not the object which is important; it's the meaning. And in a lot of tradition, like in the Shintoist tradition, the temples who are very old are destroyed every 20 years, and they are rebuilt again. And the beauty of a book is also that it can be destroyed and you can reprint again exactly the same, like in a Shintoist temple. And I love this idea that a book is old and recent at the same time. But I'm not a collector of books, I can say. That's the reason. Excuse me, because I'm sure it's full of collectors of books here.
Cristina, Christian, Jorge, thank you very, very much. Thank you all.